Good afternoon, Year 11. This is the second presentation for you on creative writing. Last lesson we looked at planning and a few ideas that you could be doing in your approaches to that, using that 10 minutes wisely. As I said last time, all of these four presentations we're going to do this week for you on creative writing are very much based on the idea of you bringing things together. And also hasten to add, these are quite subjective. Your view of what's good creative writing may be mine, and it may be the examiners, if they're important. But nonetheless, there are certain things that you can be doing to improve it. What we're going to be looking at today for your second lesson is voice. Voice and perspective. It's really, really important. You have a number of choices that you've got to make when it comes to that 10 minutes planning. You've got to come up with a narrative, and as I suggested last time round, you can do that by means of a flow chart, but use that 10 minutes really intensively and use it wisely. A lot of people say that you need to find your own voice when it comes to writing. Well, yes and no. One of the main criticisms that the exam board actually stipulate is, beyond actually people writing, as I said last time, in a very, very plot-driven way, another thing they tend to do is write in their own voice too much. And by that I mean, irrespective of what the story is, you being young people from Kent, there's a tendency for you to write in that register. And by that I mean, you tend to write as if you were a 16, 15, 16-year-old from Kent. And that needs to change, because any book or novel or whatever it might be that you're looking into, actually, sometimes it'll have very much the writer's voice coming through, but 9 times out of 10 they've created alternative voices as well, and that's what we need to be looking at. So I do say here, in addition to writing a piece which is too plot driven, a common mistake made is writing in a voice which is simply an extension of the way that you speak. And because you're presented with a particular question asking you to recount an experience, it doesn't necessarily mean that you simply have to write as you, saying this is what happened, and this is what happened. And hopefully a few exercises that we do today will prevent you from doing that. Perspective, first of all, very, very important in terms of perspective. And this is one of the choices that you need to make actually when it comes to your planning. It's not simply going to happen. You're not going to put pen to paper and things are just going to flow. It'd be good if it did, but it's unlikely it will. So one of the first choices that you have to make is thinking about, which perspective am I going to take? Now you've got two choices here, and you need to think which is most relevant to the piece of writing you're doing. The first and most common one to do is what we call the third person. Okay, so writing in third person is writing from the third person point of view, or an outsider looking into particular events. It uses pronouns like he, she, it, or they, or people by name, or individuals by name. The benefits of this and what it allows you to do writing in the third person. A first person perspective seems familiar about the writing. Okay, they know the experiences, it's from I point of view. The third person actually affords the writer much more freedom to know things about the story. If you're simply writing in the first person, you're not going to have a great deal of information. You're not going to have all the information. And some of you fall into the trap, which I'll be looking at next time, in telling us things, rather than actually showing us and telling us how things might feel, simply giving us information. Okay? If you are what's called an omniscient, which is an all-knowing third-person narrator, they know the thoughts and feelings of the characters within it, okay, which is quite a useful tool to have. If not, you can fall into what we call anachronism, where actually there might be things that you simply wouldn't know if you're writing in the first person. First person narrative is a mode of storytelling which the narrator relays events from their own point of view, using usually I rather than we, because we don't normally write in a collective voice. This device allows the audience to see the narrator's mind's eye view of a fictional universe, the universe which they've made up, or you've made up. But the problem writing in the first person is we tend to make mistakes with it because we are limited in terms of experience, but more so in terms of the awareness of the true state of things. We can say how we feel about things, but very, very often in the first person we wouldn't be aware of a particular situation. It's much more sensation and sense driven. Sometimes we call this the issue with reliability of the first person. Would we know everything if we're writing in the first person? Tends to be easier to write in the third, but there's no reason why you can't do it. But you have to make that choice again, and you have to make the appropriate choice for the piece of writing that you're doing. If you are doing, for example, a piece of writing which is meant to be suspenseful, haunted house is a common thing, that type of area, or you've been asked to write about that thing which I said last time is a very plot-driven lure for you, tell me about a time when something happened, you tend to write about it in the I. But not only are you writing in a very plot-driven way then, that it tends to be quite repetitive. You think you actually know things which you mayn't. If you're recounting a particular episode, if it's a suspenseful thing, the thing that makes it suspenseful is you don't know stuff, but you think you do when you write about it in the first person. So, you've got to make a choice. Now, we're going to carry on looking at perspective, and this is the first of the exercises I suggest you do. I'm going to keep these activities or exercises relatively brief, relatively snappy, so if you're going to try them wholeheartedly. So we'll start with this one. Okay. If you know your cinema, this is actually taken from an Alfred Hitchcock film called North by Northwest. And this is quite a famous set of images in that film. You have a man, he's in a deserted road. There is a crop duster, so a plane flying locally, dusting crops, putting fertiliser on crops. And then suddenly the plane turns around and starts coming towards our man. And you can see that in the tension of his body there. Okay? Very famously in cinema, he starts running away from that plane. The plane starts getting closer and closer, absolutely dive bombs him and just misses him. I won't tell you what happens next. If you want to watch it, it's available on good streaming channels and things like that, North by Northwest by Hitchcock. Now, not worrying too much about your planning. Okay, because I've given you what's happening. And one thing I will say at the planning, going back to last lesson, is this. Don't try and make it too epic. Don't try and actually bring it to some cataclysmic conclusion or anything like that. Sometimes the best ones, I'm not talking about the whole hackneyed idea of the cliffhanger, but sometimes the best things are those briefer accounts which are full of sensation and sense, but not necessarily coming to a huge explosive end. Whether this one does or not, I won't tell you. So don't worry about planning too much. At this stage, don't worry about description too much of the place. But you can actually obviously write about description of how someone might feel. But I want you to try, and I'll obviously pause this, or you can. I want you to try writing an account of this episode, which, let's face it, is probably 2 minutes long. First of all, in the first person, from this character's point of view. Okay, in no more than 100 words. Okay, so if you're writing the first person, you are that character. What is it you see? What is it you hear? What is it you feel? What is it you sense? What is it you do, decide to do? Okay? And in terms of that, you need to be thinking very, very clearly about what is going on inside that person's head. If you're writing that in the third person, again, he is doing this, the man. Okay? You can give him a name if you want, but probably just the man. Okay, so the man is waiting rather than I am waiting. Okay? Now try both. Do it now. If you've given that a go, then we need to actually discuss what it is that you actually notice about the contrasting differences between the two bits of writing you've just done. So you've got your 100 piece of writing from the first person point of view, and you've got the 100-word piece of writing from the third person point of view. Look through them, read through them, and then think about these questions with each one that I put at the bottom. The first one being this: how weighted is your piece in terms of action and being plot driven? Is it the first person or the third person you think has become more plot driven? I'm not saying this is a hard and fast rule, but it would tend to be the case that your third person is going to be more plot driven. Probably because you're not absolutely going to, even if you are the omniscient narrator, you're not actually going to know what's going on inside the character's head. You're going to drive things much more by it did this, the plane did this, he did this, and so on. If you're writing in the first person, then it lends itself a little bit more to that questioning what is happening, which brings me on to this. Are there any contrasting features? Use of questions. If you're writing in the first person, much more likely you're going to be questioning. What am I doing here? When's the next bus coming along? What's that plane doing? Is it getting louder? Why is it doing what it's doing? What am I going to do about it? So it might be, if you are thinking of writing something suspenseful like that, it might be you consider that writing in the first person could be better. Okay? But again, no hard and fast rules. But usually, and also, which one is more likely to be about emotions? I would suggest probably the first person. So, if you're writing in that way, maybe you're writing something which is to do with tension, maybe first person would be better. Your choices. Okay, and as I say, think about which perspective is right for the piece of writing you're doing. Now we're going to come on to voice and narrative voice. Narrative voice is the voice, if you like, which is telling the story. Okay? So whether you choose to adopt a first or third person perspective to your writing, in that 10 minutes of planning, you also need to consider which narrative voice you'll adopt. That is the voice telling the story. This narrator can tell the reader what is happening, to whom, so introduce character, which we'll talk about later on. It might add description as well, with all that array of techniques that you know how to use, which we'll talk about later on. And even, the narrator might give a bit of insight, a bit of commentary, moral radar, that type of thing, saying what's right and wrong. Now, as you can see with this extract, which you might be familiar with, from John Steinbeck, the narrative voice, in this case is a third-person narrative voice, should and is different from other voices within it. And if you're simply writing in your own voice, your 15, 16-year-old Kent student voice, then actually you're not doing what you've been asked to do, which is craft language. You need to be thinking about a voice for your narrator. Is that narrator going to be first person? Is that narrator going to be third person perspective? But additional voices that are in there as well. So I'll just read this to you by way of illustration. Okay? For a moment the place was lifeless, and then two men emerged from the path and came into the opening by the green pool. They'd walked in single file down the path, and even in the open one stayed behind the other. Both were dressed in denim trousers and in denim coats with brass buttons. Both wore black shapeless hats, and both carried tight blanket rolls slung over their shoulders. The first man was small and quick, dark of face with restless eyes and sharp, strong features. Every part of him was defined. Small, strong hands, slender arms, a thin and bony nose. Behind him walked his opposite, a huge man, shapeless of face with large, pale eyes and wide, sloping shoulders. And he walked heavily, dragging his feet a little the way a bear drags his paws. His arms did not swing at his sides, but hung loosely. The first man stopped short in the clearing, and the follower nearly ran over him. He took off his hat and wiped the sweatband with his forefinger and snapped the moisture off. His huge companion dropped his blankets and flung himself down and drank from the surface of the green pool. Drank with long gulps, snorting into the water like a horse. The small man stepped nervously beside him. "Lenny," he said sharply. "Lenny, for God's sake, don't drink so much." Lenny continued to snort into the pool. The small man leaned over and shook him by the shoulder. "Lenny, you're going to make yourself sick like you was last night." Lenny dipped his whole head under, hat and all, and then he sat up on the bank and his hat dripped down on his blue coat and ran down his back. "That's good," he said. "You drink some, George. You take a good big drink." Now, taken from Advice and Men, which you might have done, there are a number of voices. This is the opening extract from the entire novel. And you can see straight away we have voices. Now, just looking at it again, how many voices can you hear in there? I say hear because obviously I read it to you. But when you read it, you should almost be creating that voice. I could have done the narrating voice, because Steinbeck was from California, not that I'm going to, in an American accent, because it had been absolutely relevant to the man who wrote it, John Steinbeck, California in the 1930s. If we look at this version of exactly the same extract, we can see how many voices we've got at work. And obviously one at the moment is predominant, but later on and in different passages in the novel you have alternative voices in there. So having read the opening extract, we can see there are three voices. The narrator, in this case Steinbeck himself. So the majority of the description of place is done by the narrator. And that's place, the people, introducing them, and so on. And then we've got another character, and another voice comes with that character. Now obviously I've highlighted it to you, not just in purple here, but in a particular accent which is quite a tough accent. So that's character 1. In this case it's George. And we get that through his dialogue. Now this isn't going to be a presentation, a lesson on how we use speech marks, but using speech for our characters can be a very, very interesting and relevant way to make actually a variety of prose style used, but actually give alternative voices to our work as well. And then we have our third speaker, or our third voice if you like, which is Lenny at the bottom. But unless you'd actually read this a number of times, how are you to know what alternative voices are like and what needs to go into them? Now these are a few things which I think you could actually consider when you're looking at alternative voices. Your narrator's voice, but character voices as well. So you've got things like, what's the level of formality of your narrating voice? How far it adheres to what we call the rules of standard English. Now standard English sounds a really complicated thing, but it's not. Every time that you have your book marked by me or by another teacher or anything like that, every time we're correcting a piece of punctuation, correcting a piece of spelling called orthography, anything like that, paragraphing, it's because you haven't stuck to the rules of English, what we consider to be correct English. And it might be that your narrator, the person who does most of that, at least in the introduction bit there, is writing in standard English. Maybe. If you are, excuse me, deviating from that, which means if you're not writing in standard English or something like that, be sure that actually you're signposting that in such a way that the examiner knows that that's your intention. They don't just want to think you are spelling badly or putting poor grammar in or poor syntax in, which I'll come on to in a moment, because you don't know how to do it. Okay? It needs to be clear that you are doing it for a reason. So you need to be thinking about the level of formality of each of your narrators. So you've got your narrative voice, but then you have a character comes in. How are they going to be different as a speaker, as a voice? Then you might create a particular accent. Okay? Now, there can be various ways we can do that, which differentiates it from your standard English voice. The accent of standard English is what we call received pronunciation, which is very much the way that I speak. It's an educated, south-eastern accent. But it might be that you choose to actually give a voice an accent. It might be your narrative voice, the main voice, the person telling the story, actually might have an accent. It might be that each of your characters have different accents from different places. Okay? If you want to do that, and again, it's about controlling it and making sure it's clear you're doing it, you can see in some famous books and writers like Irvine Welsh in Scotland, but Steinbeck does it a bit, where they actually spell things the way that they sound. Okay? So, you might have noticed that rather than saying going to, George says gonna. Okay? And from that we get a bit of his American accent. You're gonna do that. Okay? So you can use iDialect to give different voices. Your narrative voice might be standard English, but your character's voices mayn't be. You can use that to do that. You might try and somehow indicate what we call their prosodic features. And again, this can be your narrator, or it can be other characters that you introduce as well. And by prosodic features, we all have prosodic features. It's the way that we speak. Prosodic features can be the use of volume, going from very loud to quiet, or it can be pausing for effect. It might be stressing particular words in a particular way, that type of thing. And you can do that through the use of vocabulary. So if I sort of said my character exclaimed something, I'm putting exclamation marks in my speech marks and so on, and even changing the font style, making it, capitalizing it, then you can give an idea of the way that they are saying something, which might be different from your narrative voice. So do try thinking about your prosodic features. One thing that we all have, every single one of us has got a distinct use of language. And you actually think about the way that you use language, everybody uses language, your colleagues use language, your teachers use language, families use language and so on. We all have a particular way of using language. It might be something called the phonetic features of our language, the way that our language sounds. But very often it's actually the words that we use and the phrases that we use. And it stands to reason that a teacher, of an English teacher like me, might have a broader vocabulary than some of you. That's not patronising, it's simply saying that you're younger, so you're not going to have as broad vocabulary as me. But you will know words that I don't know in your vocabulary. And there are quite a few, I'd imagine. But nonetheless, think about how your narrator will use vocabulary, and think about how your other speakers and voices might use alternative vocabulary. And I've put in vocabulary and idioms as well. And by idioms, I mean phrases and literary features. It's much more likely that your descriptive narrator is going to use imagery than your characters, unless that character is somehow a bit like your narrator. If you are writing a story about professors at a university and they were always using very, very ornate, verbose language and that sort of thing, they might use a lot of literary device, but it's unlikely. Your narrator will, but your speakers will not. But also think about the phrases that people use a great deal. Syntax as well. We all have a tendency to structure our spoken language in a particular way, even our written language. Sometimes you might notice that you start sentences when you write them in a particular way. You might have been taught in the past to start a sentence with an adverb and it becomes something you do a great deal. Or you might end a spoken sentence with what we call a non-fluency feature. Okay, as a South Londoner, I have a tendency to say, do you know what I mean? A lot. Okay, and that's called a non-fluency feature. I put it at the end of things that I say. Okay, so it might just be you're thinking your narrator might be using language in one way, in his or her use of language, and each of your speakers and other people and characters that you're introducing might use alternative language. The only thing that I would say is this before I put you onto a second exercise. Okay, what I'm going to ask you to do, you can do it if you want, is writing in the third person, so he, she, it, they, create a narrative voice to describe a place. So don't mind what the place is. Just like George and Nellie walked into a clearing, we've got characters here walking into particular situations, but it could be characters walking into a school, it could be characters walking into woodland, it could be characters walking in a park, whatever. And you've got arrival of two characters. Now what you should be practicing here, and no more than 300 words, so one side is sufficient for this. So it needs to be crafted and be as good as you can possibly make it. In no more than 300 words, introduce the place. Now, in the next presentation, I'll be talking to you about descriptive writing. I'll be talking to you about using imagery, I'll be talking to you about sensations, describing senses, all things like that to make good description, what we call show, don't tell. Okay? So don't worry about that too much. Obviously you can put those in there, but you need to start off with your narrative voice. It doesn't have to be starting with it. You can start with another character, with this character speaking. Okay? But the narrative voice, the one that gives you that omniscient, all-knowing information, okay, will be one voice. Okay? Tone of it, formality, completely up to you. Generally speaking, though, it tends to be a bit more formal. Then I want you to introduce two other characters. And through speech marks, through dialogue, okay, introduce two different voices. So you're going to have three voices in all. Like I said, we'll focus on literary technique and so on in due course. So make the focus of this clearly not writing in your own voice, unless one of your characters is someone like you. Or indeed, if your narrator is purposefully someone like you, with your use of language, your idiom. But generally speaking, I think it'd be a better exercise, you can better practice, if what you try and do is actually make it you're writing three alternative, distinct, and other voices in which you are writing. It doesn't have to have, in terms of the planning of it, in terms of the plot of your 300 words, anything particular happening. Okay, it might simply be a description of a place, it might simply be two characters arriving there, okay, and speaking to each other about where they find themselves. You could end it, if you particularly want to, on something which might act as the springboard to the rest of a narrative, to the rest of a story. But in 300 words, you can see actually, if you do something good, and actually, for the purposes of an exam, it'd be 450 to 600 words, you wouldn't have that much more to write in terms of the plot. Okay? It might be going back to presentation number 1, that if you actually got your planning there, and you've got that arrow, this bit in which you've actually got your two characters arriving in a particular scene, or a character arriving in a scene, so you'd end up with two narrative voices, is simply that first 100 words, then whatever the temporal shift might be, you go back and tell a story and you return at the end to it. Really is up to you. But for the purposes of this, focus it on voice. You can pause it on that, obviously, to give yourself some ideas. And next lesson, or next time, that's tomorrow, we'll be looking at literary techniques. So all those things you've learned over the years, in analysis and creative writing, so all your similes and metaphors and things like that. Use of personification. Making sure you understand what is meant by show, don't tell. And making sure that you are focusing any piece of creative writing on those senses. And it tends to be quite a hackneyed idea about simply writing to the senses, but you'd be amazed how many of you, in pieces of work that you've done, I'm sure, simply in your assault to actually write something very plot driven, disregard things other than that sense of sight and how things look. Much, much better to create an atmosphere, much, much better to create something believable for somebody if you actually can appeal to their senses as well. But that's for tomorrow. So give those two activities a go. Give the activity a go on writing the first person and the third person, seeing if you can identify any difference in your own writing. And then give it a go in terms of writing in 3 alternative voices as well. And I'll see you tomorrow.